In this video lecture, we're going to get started talking about viruses, chapter 5 in your textbook. And to start off with, we're going to cover in a little bit more detail the position of viruses across the biological spectrum. Now, some of this we've talked about before. We've already discussed how viruses are acellular, so they're not composed of cells. A virus is not a cell. And they are obligate intracellular parasites. So what that means is when a virus is out in the open environment somewhere and it's not inside a host cell, it's not really doing anything. It's not metabolically active. It's just genetic material covered in a protective shell. A virus has to go inside a host cell, and it basically hijacks the machinery of the host cell in order to be reproduced. So viruses are obligate intracellular parasites. What is a virus? A virus essentially consists of just the viral genome. That's the genetic material of the virus. Just like living things have genomes, so do viruses. The viral genomes are much, much smaller than the genomes of a living organism, though, because they are simpler. They're much simpler. They're not as complex as a cellular organism is. And now the genome can be DNA or RNA. It depends on the type of virus. So viruses are going to violate some of those rules we learned about in Chapter 8, where you always go from DNA to RNA to protein to trade. Viruses have some different strategies in some cases. So you've got the viral genome. That's going to be on the interior of the virus, and then it is surrounded by a capsid. That is a protein covering or shell that wraps it up and covers it, and the idea there is to protect the genome. And some viruses have additional layers as well that we will discuss. So here's a kind of a number of viruses have this shape. This is called an icosahedron, this kind of geometric shape, and there's the purple squiggly nucleic acid. That's the genome on the interior. The capsid is a protein shell. The whole point of the capsid basically is to protect that genome while the virus is, after it gets released from a host cell where it was made, it has to travel to a new host cell, and that genome is sensitive. It needs to be protected, because if the genome gets destroyed, there's obviously going to be no blueprints available for manufacturing new viruses in another host cell. So be sure to look over Table 5.1 in your textbook, because this is giving you some general properties of viruses, and you want to be familiar with those. Some of these we've already discussed. Now this one, viruses are obligate intracellular parasites of bacteria, protozoans, fungi, algae, plants, and animals. So many living things have at least one virus that can infect them. They're ubiquitous in nature. They've had a major impact on the development of biological life. We all have to live with our viruses, and they have influenced the changes that have occurred in life forms over time. Very tiny. They're considered to be, that should be ultra microscopic. Looks like there was a typo in this version of the textbook. So their sizes range from 20 nanometers in diameter to 450 nanometers, and a nanometer is a billionth of a meter. So we've talked about how bacteria are in the micrometer range, and that's a millionth of a meter. So these can be anywhere from 10 times smaller than a bacterial cell to more like 100 times smaller than a bacterial cell. They don't independently fulfill all the characteristics of living things, so they're not by themselves metabolically active. They've got to go into a host cell to reproduce. We talked about the basic structure and some of these other things. So be sure you review that table if you have not already read that in your textbook. Oh, this is key as well. They don't have the machinery for synthesizing proteins. They don't have ribosomes. They don't have tRNAs to escort in amino acids to build proteins. So when they go inside a host cell, one of the key reasons why they need a host cell is so that host cell will read the genes of the viral genome and express those genes, produce the proteins of the virus. Okay, so that was kind of a quick little introduction to viruses. In the second video clip for Chapter 5, we'll talk a little bit more about the structure of viruses and take a look at some of the variation that exists out there among different types of viruses.